Oops, no, that's too much. I'm sorry. All right, there we go. Okay, welcome back. It's Friday, yay! We're, working our way through the semester. We're, 3 weeks in? Where's my pen? Oh, I left my pen in my backpack. Well, there shall be no writing on the slides today, I guess. Right, because I slid it in my backpack after my evening class on Wednesday. Okay, so I might have to just doodle with my finger. Or not. It's all good. Okay, so last time, right, what were we talking about? We were talking about religion. Shock. No, sorry. It's so Friday. All right, my 4-year-old, he's almost 5. He's 5 tomorrow. But he was up at 4 o'clock this morning because he couldn't find his stickers. And he was worried that we'd thrown them out. I was like, please, go back to sleep. For the love of God. So if I'm a little spacey, that's why. Okay, so we're talking about religion, right? And we had finished up with our, what is religion kind of definition. And we are moving in now to how religion works, right? We started this discussion by just kind of reaffirming what Smith says, which is that religion as compared to other social institutions is not so much unique for what it does, right? What it does is a lot of things that other institutions also do, but why it does it. This one needs a new battery. Yeah, so again, not so much what it does, but why it does it, which again is that access to superhuman powers. So we're moving in now to basically a section of Smith's argument, which focuses really on how religion influences society, right? What he calls the causal mechanisms of religion's influence, of which there are, I believe, if I'm not, oopsie. Oh, it's doing this again. It's doing that thing where it won't let me page forward. Okay, hang on, I have to shut down PowerPoint and restart. Short, babidi. All right, let's try this again. My PowerPoint is having a Friday as well. I think it's because of Slido, which occasionally breaks PowerPoint. Okay, we're back. Well, I mean, bless you, Joan. I said, someone sneezed in class. It was actually in Source of Religion last year, and I said, bless you. And then someone put in the Slido. That freaked me out because I just sneezed at home. And I thought that was pretty funny. Okay. Hang on. We should be back here. Okay, perfect. All right. So, yeah. The causal mechanisms of which... Come on. Okay. It is... I am frustrated. Let us end task on PowerPoint and see if that helps. Why are you doing this to me, PowerPoint? All right, I'm gonna try this one more time, and then I'm gonna probably lie down on the floor and just give up. It's like, Friday has beaten me, friends.
You give up, we go home.
No, you have to sit there the entire time I'm giving up. That's part of the deal. Awkwardly talk to each other while I give up on the floor. Okay. There are always ways. I don't know what they will be, but there are always ways. If I hit present in Slido, is that gonna... Slido. There we go. All right, so the causal mechanisms, of which there are several. Okay, so we talked about this last time. We started with this because this is probably the most straightforward causal mechanism that Smith talks about, which is what he calls prescriptive teachings, right? Which is just the teachings of any particular religion. Each religion has its own set of teachings that cause people to do certain things, right? Whether that is, attending worship on certain days, reading certain texts, doing prayers on certain days, at certain times, right? Fasting during certain periods, right? If you're Muslim, right, during Ramadan, you fast. I guess if you're like an Eastern Orthodox Christian, you're supposed to fast during a bunch of periods, including High Lent and all of these sorts of things, right? But they shape the lives of people, and often then, these teachings will go on to shape the institutions, cultures of surrounding religious practices, right? Or surrounding the religious practitioners. So sometimes the things that religious people do will end up shaping the society that they're in as well, even in say, the non-religious sphere. Like, things like the fact that we have a weekend, right? That it's considered a sort of rest time. In a lot of ways goes back, and it used to be, though it's not really anymore, that Sundays, everything was closed, right? That businesses wouldn't generally operate because, it was seen as the Lord's Day, a rest day, right? So that is just a basic kind of example of how, the beliefs of religious practitioners can shape the lives of a society, right? And there's innumerable other ways, right? But that's just a really obvious sort of example. Okay, so this restaurant is just opening now in Edmonton, but it's called Chick-fil-A. Very good chicken sandwiches. I haven't had them in Edmonton, but every time I went to the States, I'd always get some Chick-fil-A. Like the chicken sandwiches. But one of the weird things about Chick-fil-A is they're closed on Sundays. Why? Well, because the owner, I think his name is Dan Cathy, is an evangelical Christian, and he believes in taking that day as a day of rest. So he gives it to his workers too. So Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays because of prescriptive religious teachings. Okay. So, and like I said, I love this lady's face. I don't know if I can draw with my finger. No, I can't, but pen. It's just way over the top. Very excited to be meeting Donald Trump, apparently. But okay, you see, like, what's probably more pertinent than her face is the sign in the background, right? Thank you, Lord Jesus, for President Trump. Okay, so this is causal mechanism number 2, the social influence of network ties. And this pertains, in some senses, to non-religious behaviors that in some way get sort of tied into religious communities, right? So, as Smith kind of says, sometimes being part of a religious community can cause people to adopt certain behaviors, even if they're not explicitly taught by that religious group. So, really clear examples of this, right? If you look at, more conservative Christians, whether, evangelical or Roman Catholic in the US, more conservative Christians almost always favor the Republican Party, right? It's not really particularly close. I can show you the polling, but why bother, right? It's something like 80% of evangelicals favor the Republican Party and about 70% of conservative Roman Catholics, right? Or white Roman Catholics. Now, it does not say, say in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, thou shalt vote Republican, or in, in the Bible for evangelicals, right, that you should favor an economically conservative political party. But what happens is, being part of that kind of network, right, you're part of these communities, and those communities have this behavior which tends to bring people in those communities along, right? It's sort of, in a way, a sort of groupthink, right? People who are in those communities and are being influenced by other people in those communities will tend to move towards the same kinds of behaviors, whether those behaviors, often in this case, where those behaviors are not prescribed by the religion. Now, they may come up with religious justifications for those things, right? So a lot of times, something like, if you ever tie into the discourses around homeschooling, people will come up with religious justifications for, say, schooling your children at home. That said, again, there's nothing in, in a lot of Orthodox Jews, conservative Roman Catholics, and evangelicals homeschool. There's nothing in any of those religions explicitly that says, thou shalt shun public education, right? It's just something that ends up catching on in those communities for a bunch of reasons that are more connected to network ties, right? If you're in a network, you're one dot in this kind of network, and all of these people are homeschoolers, right? The chance that you're going to become a homeschooler as well is probably somewhat higher, right? Because you're being influenced by them. Okay, so because religious communities tend to be fairly tight-knit networks, well, often, not always, but often, it will then draw people into certain behaviors, certain ways of thinking, right? You're being influenced by other people, and the people around you, the people you value the most. So those network ties are going to pull you in the direction of a lot of non-religious behaviors that group also values. Okay, does that all make sense? Yeah, please.
When we talk about prescribing and official sort of religious foundations, what if in a small town we have a local priest talking about going to homeschool? Is that not also prescribing teachings, but it's coming from personal authority, but maybe not officially?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Can I say it would depend? Like, it would depend in which way it's being kind of taught by that religious official, right? If it's like, let's say it's being taught as, this is probably better, right? That I would say is not prescriptive teaching. That would sort of be more in the realm of network ties. Now that individual sort of plays a really prominent role in those network ties, right? He's, assume he, she, depending on which group you're in, would be sort of, within a network, a really central node, right? So it'd be like, I don't know, if I could draw a really big circle, right? All other people would orbit around that because of the kind of religious authority they have. I would say mostly that's more what you're looking for or looking at in the case you're describing. If, in the case that they're saying like, this is, I don't know how you would make the case for this, but this is what God demands, that you school your children at home. In that case, you're moving into prescriptive teachings, because that particular, religious authority is saying, yeah, this is, in Deuteronomy 9:9, it says, something, that means you should homeschool. You're kind of crossing that line. But I think for the most part, like if it's expressed as sort of a preference, this would be better. Or, probably like you should send your kid to the Catholic school. That's less of a prescriptive teaching and more of kind of the influence of network ties, just that individual is really prominent, and so they have a lot of pull. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, perfect. Other questions? That's a great question. Really digging into Smith's concept. I like it. Good? All right. She's very happy. Okay. Very excited. Is he touching the baby? He is touching. She's excited he's touching her baby. That's what's happening. I wouldn't be. Okay. So, contextual effects. Causal mechanism number 3 is contextual effects. Okay, so contextual effects is basically as follows. The larger social context that you live in, right? So the broad society will exert a sort of slow gravitational pull on the people living with it, independently of say, their religious characteristics. So what does this look like, right? Basically, okay, let's read the second point. The religious causal mechanism, this one, operates on persons through the religious features of the collective, rather than directly through networks of individuals. So basically, it's like religion has a sort of gravity, right? And if you're in a setting that has more religion, that gravitational pull is kind of going to pull you towards more religious behavior, whether you are particularly religious or not. Now so I'll put it this way. Let's say you live here, right? This is what's lovingly referred to as the Bible Belt, right? The really most religious part of the United States, sort of south of the Mason-Dixon line, in those states in the South, particularly dominated by American evangelicalism and increasingly Latin American Catholicism. It's called the Bible Belt because it's the most religious part of the country. Rates of religiosity here are considerably higher. Now, let's say you are from, you can't really see them because I cut them off in my picture, but you're from over here, right? You're from the independent state of Cascadia, right? Oregon, Washington, California, some of the least religious parts of the country. Or over here, you know, the religious dead zone that is New England. What happens if you, so you start out here and you're not particularly religious, right? Or from here. And you're not particularly religious, but you then move down to here. You can't see my arrow because it's red on red. Let's make it blue. You move down here. What tends to happen is that regardless of your inherent religiosity, you'll become a little bit more religious, right? That you would, because the environment itself is a little bit more religious, you're going to find yourself, you know, maybe engaging in more religious behavior. Maybe, you know, you never attended religious services when you were up here or here. But when you move down here, you're like, you know, I'll go on Passover, or I'll go, you know, I'll start attending Seders, or I'll go to Mass at Christmas and Easter, or I'll, you know, I'm not a particularly practicing Muslim, but I'll start fasting during Ramadan, right? So regardless of what, you know, this is the Bible Belt, but if you were Jewish and you moved down to the Bible Belt, chances are you would get a little bit more Jewish. If you're Muslim and you move down to the Bible Belt, you would get a little bit more Muslim, right? Because that overall environment is a little bit more religious. Now, the inverse also carries, right? So, if you're living, let's say here, right? You're down in Florida, pretty religious, and you move over to here, right? You get a job in Cascadia, you move off, and you end up in Portland, Oregon. Chances are that because the environment of Portland, Oregon is less religious, you yourself are going to find that you become a little bit less religious. You attend less frequently, you're less devoted in your study of religious documents, you know, you pray less, whatever it happens to be, because you're affected by the overall religious context of the place that you are. So, and I mean, this can be, and we'll talk about this when we talk about, say, the nuns, this can be a sort of like over time escalation as well, right? You know, people here are less religious, so sorry, that's Idaho. I don't know if I don't actually know the religious context of Idaho, but like I said, I cut off California and Oregon, Washington. Oh yeah, let's say over here. Over time, you know, as that irreligious sort of life starts to build, generation on generation, that slow drift away from religion's gravitational pull will get weaker and weaker, and more people will become less religious, regardless of the background, right? So, I mean, someone moving from, let's say, a very religious place, I'm trying to think of one, let's say Nigeria, right? Nigeria is pretty religious, and they move to Canada. Canada is a fairly irreligious country overall, and what's going to tend to happen is that as people move from Nigeria to Canada, right, let's say they move to Vancouver, which is probably the least religious place in Canada, or maybe Victoria would be, they're pretty close. They're going to, even if they were religious in Nigeria, they're going to find that gravitational pull of the whole society having religious impulses gets weaker and weaker, and their religious impulses are going to get weaker as well. Now, that doesn't mean like you're going to go from like, I don't know, let's just put it numerically, you know, on the religiosity scale, you were a 9 out of 10 and you move to Vancouver and you end up at a 0, right? That's not particularly likely, but you might go from a 9 to like a 7, right? And the same thing, right? If you moved from Edmonton to, I'm trying to think of where, like to Texas. Let's say Texas. Not Houston, because Houston's different. But let's say you move to Lubbock. You move to Lubbock, Texas, which is still a relatively religious place. You might go from, say, 3. And you would go up, I don't know, I'm drawing this backward, to like a 4 or 5. Right? So again, not a huge, you're not like suddenly like you move from Edmonton to Lubbock, Texas, and you're like, praise Jesus. It's much more subtle than that, right? It's like I am going to pray occasionally, right? That would be more what it looks like, or slightly more than I do now because of that kind of shifting context. The contextual effects of where you are and how religious that environment is going to affect your religiosity overall, but in subtle ways, right? And over time, it could be, like your grandchildren are a 2, you are a 9, and your grandchildren are a 2, because that kind of slow drift of contextual effects is drawing them away from religion over time. Sorry, does that all make sense? Okay. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't. Really, when you want to ask a question, like commit.
Being Nigerian and then living from there to here, I would say like my family is still extremely religious, just because they were able to find other Nigerians who were also like you. So
Right.
I feel like for that, and maybe like people who grew up here that are from other places that might be more religious, I feel like it's really just like if you're really religious and like deep down, like it's something that you care about mentality,
Right.
then I feel like you would then carry that to wherever you go. Would you say that would be like?
I think that's mostly true. I think it's like, again, it's really subtle. It's like maybe in Nigeria you're a 10 and you drift down to like a 9.5, right? And it's like, okay, well, in Nigeria, I never would have missed a single religious service. And now I missed one to take my kid to soccer practice, right? So it can be really subtle. But over time, right, I would say like second, third, and you see this, for instance, a lot in research on people from the Philippines, right? Parents will come, parents are extremely Catholic. Second generation, it's like, Third generation, it's like, well, and then fourth generation, they're just like on par with the overall religious environment, right? So they've sort of like, it's dissipated over time with that kind of slow gravitational pull, where that cultural energy of, say, intense religion in the Philippines isn't there to kind of hold it all together. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then also, like, when you play soccer practice, like, that again also implies there's, like, social aspects of it. I mean, obviously.
Yeah, it's entirely like the context, right? Like everybody else is skipping church to take their kids to soccer practice, so you do too. Right, but where at home, that wouldn't have happened because, at home, and like, another place that's more religious, there would have been more room for that kind of religious exception. But in Canada, it's like, what? You don't want to work on Sunday? Yeah, suck it up. Yeah, the individual choices are sort of shaped by that social context, right? So yeah, in a society where, Sunday is sacred, okay, that's a lot easier to not work. Whereas, in a society that's secular and people are like, oh, you need Sundays off to go to church? Yeah, sorry, we can't do that, right? Because that's not how we work. Go get a job at Chick-fil-A. But does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have a question as well?
Well, I find this always like an expand. I think also it could relate to like the strictness of society because, for example, in Eastern Europe, if you go to an Orthodox church, like all the women will have their heads covered and they'll wear like dresses that are long. But here, like the Orthodox church is still strict and still like wants women to like cover their hair when they come into church and like wear like more modest clothing. But like for example, just because society in general here is very like lenient, a lot of people will still like, okay, I'll still cover my head, but like I'll wear trousers to church instead of like
a long skirt. Yeah.
Like stuff like that. And I think even though like there are some people that are really, really like into their religion and won't like waver at all, I think that naturally, like when the society is lenient, everybody does a little bit.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's a great example. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, please.
I'm just wondering if you would say that contextual effects are unidirectional, or if it can like go kind of back and forth on a spectrum depending on like the social context that you're in.
So, if I understand your question, you're asking, is it only in the direction of like more or like irreligion, or?
What if you like we have a society that's really religious and then a society that's not very religious on each end of the spectrum, and
right.
Like you can move to Texas, let's say, and become more religious, but then you leave and you go back to New England. Could you also go the opposite direction?
Absolutely, right? Once you like change the context, those pressures that were put, or that, I guess I want to say gravity, that gravitational pull that was, say, pulling you towards that being more religious, once that's gone, okay, then you're going to probably be pulled back towards that sort of more irreligious social context. So yeah, if you change places and change context, that is going to change as well. And again, I don't want to oversell it, because what Smith's talking about isn't necessarily like, I moved, I lost my religion in like 30 seconds, right? It's a very gradual, very kind of like gravity, right? It's a slow, steady force rather than one that's like super powerful. And it like, just like, you're not getting whiplash religiously, you're more just kind of like being drawn toward what that social norm is. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. Is it Michael?
Yeah. Would the Hays Code be a method of realizing contextual effects?
So the Hays Code, you're talking about the kind of code of that was in place in Hollywood that limited what you could show in movies. I think if anything, the Hays Code is probably more of let's say a symptom of this kind of contextual effect. A more religious society is going to have rules like the Hays Code that says like, you can't show people in bed. Like this is like in the 40s, right? You couldn't show people in bed together, right? So even you had to, if they were going to have slept together, you had to sort of like imply that they had slept together, right? Which is why in the movie Casablanca, though it's pretty clear that the two main characters, Rick and Elsa, probably slept together after she came to him in the middle of the night, what they show you is more, them chatting afterwards and her buttoning up her top, right? So they don't show them in bed having, whatever, 1940s sex and all that. They just kind of show you the aftermath, and you're left to fill in the kind of blanks. I would say that's more of a symptom than like that's what happens because of contextual effects. You're going to follow those more kind of religious prescriptions. You have a very quick follow-up.
Yeah, just I was thinking there was sort of an imposition of Catholic morning on the majority at the time. So we're going to be then trying to influence the culture using a sort of a contextual effect, making it more aligned with their values.
I would have to think about that. I'd have to be honest, I'd have to review the history of the Hays Code and its sort of like historical origins in order to really answer that question in depth. And the truth is, I'm like, I know what the Hays Code was, but its actual sort of origins, I'd have to like kind of revisit. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Is that like, I'll call it broad, is it like changing sizes at all over the years of influence out, like having more religious influence, like the Bible Belt? Like, was there a time where it covered like most of the states and it's like slowly shrinking down, or is it just kind of been consistently stayed that size?
Yeah, we'll talk about the religious landscape as we go through, but I mean, if you had gone back to say 1952, let's say 19, well, I don't know why, random year, you probably would have found that 90% of people were Christian and 90% of people would have said that they attended religious services at least once a month, right? Roughly speaking. That's probably about the height of religious attendance in the US. And that kind of shrinks through the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Really, it's still pretty healthy in the 90s, but then like in the 90s, you get this kind of steep decline in religion and a really sharp rise in what are called the nuns, right? N-O-N, yes, not N-U-N-S, because that would be nonsensical. And there's lots of kind of complex social reasons for that. That said, this, I think that screen doesn't do anything. That's not my laptop. It's not evenly distributed, right? And there are certain things like this area, it's a really good question. This area is dominated by a different religious group than say here. Down here, you have more what are called evangelical Christians. And up in the north, you have more what's called mainline Christians. And the differences are kind of subtle but important. It's like these folks actually see an increase in their numbers from the 1950s forward. The mainline, so the evangelicals see an increase. Mainline Protestants see a huge decrease, right? And actually the line pretty much goes like this, like downward slope, almost the same slope as the rise of the nuns, right? I'll show you graphs of this. It's cool to see because it's like literally the lines pretty much like make an X as one goes down, the other one goes up. And so we talk about some religious theories and say Rodney Stark. Sometimes religions kind of get exhausted. And what I think happened here is that the mainline Protestants, the religion just got exhausted, right? And it stopped having its appeal. And then that, blob, as you say, sort of shrunk up here. But this one, the down here stayed relatively healthy. And so it's shrunk, but it hasn't shrunk as quickly, right? It's been much better at enduring and sort of adapting to new social circumstances. So that's it's a really good question. It's a really long and rambling answer. I'm sorry. Wow. Okay. Actually, I think he had his hand up first, and then I'll go. Okay, please.
When you talk about in terms of specifically like immigration, when people move from one place to another place, is it a rule that they suddenly move from like a 10 to a 9.5 always? Because I've seen some people out of like retrospect saying that none of the people around me are following this. They become even more sort of
super
like,
religious.
super religious just because no one else is following it.
Right. Okay. I mean, I would say on the whole, the direction is like if you took the majority becomes more like the environment they move into. There's obviously going to be individual level kind of differences, which I'll be honest, sociology is sort of bad at individual level differences and more like large statistical kind of moves, right? So you tend to see, like, for example, in Europe, right, when you have Muslim immigrants move to Europe, what tends to happen over time, right, once you get to second, third generation, they become more secular. They become more like the environment, barring, some social dislocation problems, right? If they can't get jobs, if they're discriminated against, that can kind of play against it. But the trajectory tends, like, say, Turks in Germany, or Turkish people in Germany, right? They've been moving there since the 50s. And the longer they're there, the more irreligious and less kind of rigidly Muslim they become. But again, there are exceptions where some people are like, will turn back to that identity in a way of looking for, an authentic identity that maybe German society isn't offering them. Or because they're Turkish, they can't ever be really fully part of German society, and then they end up turning back. But the direction of travel tends to be more towards whatever that society is. On the whole, but again, individual level differences exist. They're just hard to measure sociologically. Yeah, please, you had a question. Hello, you're scrolling. Yes, you had a question.
I just wanted to kind of ask if the reason that maybe this part of America has such a high
Religiosity.
and just like stability overall, would it also, is there also a chance that people are just simply moving there and that's another reason why it's kind of like doing that? Because just like you said, if you come from somewhere and you find that other people aren't like you, but like you really hold your values, like they're really important to you. I can understand like someone moving across the country to be in a place where they more accepted and more supported. So would you think?
So you move from godless California to everything's sunny and shiny, Jesus, 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 Texas? Okay. That's potentially true. I think we've probably seen more of that in the US context anyway in the last maybe 10 years, right? The other thing that's happened though, and this is where it gets complicated, and I think some of this is a little bit overdetermined, is this is also, like, I'm going to circle it in yellow for money. This is, if you're talking economically, this is sort of increasingly the economic powerhouse of the United States. So lots of people are moving there. And yeah, you're seeing a lot more kind of religiosity pop up, but people are moving from places like here where it's super expensive and here where you can afford a shoebox for $1 million and the taxes are 99%, to the southeast of the country for a lot of economic reasons. So I think, okay, I'll put it this way. A lot of Jewish people have moved here from New York and LA, right? Because they find this is more friendly to their kind of religious beliefs, but there's also a ton of economic opportunity, right? So the things kind of have to go together. And yeah, what's happening is a lot of people move in there that are religious. That's probably the leading edge. But then a lot of other people move in there and become more religious because the people who have moved there first were more religious to start with, right? Does that kind of make sense? Sort of? Okay. Yes, you had a question. Wow, you guys love the contextual effect. Like, no questions the whole course until contextual effects. Now you just want to know everything. Please.
So, like, say, like, a different religion, or, like, similar to different community, lean towards more that religion because they feel like their own religion isn't as supported. Like the soccer example you used before, like say as a Muslim, right? They have on Fridays are like our religious days, right? So we ask for like excuse me or whatever, but I guess because you're not as supported, like you don't actually, like do you think that our religion would actually increase because we're not able to?
So I think if I understand what you're asking, would people say who are Muslim maybe move more towards being Christian than or less religious? I think in Smith's kind of conception of this is they would lean into their own kind of Muslim identity, right? More towards what they already know. Now, there's always going to be people who convert, right? That happens. People convert from religions or fall out of religion. Anyway, I could, sorry. I'm getting my brain out of order because now I can start talking about marginal peel off, but we don't want to talk about that yet. We're a little early. But Smith's conception, at least here, is that people will lean into their existing religious identity rather than generally adopt a new one. Adopting a new one comes with a lot of social pain because you have to often then leave your community, go against your family, and these sorts of things, if that makes sense. Yeah, so if you as a Muslim move into an area that's dominated by devout Roman Catholics, like 90% of them go to church on Sundays, and you're going to become more religious, but in your own religion, right? You're not probably going to convert to Catholicism, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, no problem. Please.
I find it's kind of similar, but because right now we're looking at one religion, like this place is dominated by one religion. But if we see a place, say like Canada, for example, there's so many Muslim people moving here, so now like for example, even ways in Taste of Edmonton, every stand said we have halal products, and you wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, to be honest.
Right.
But now with all the Ukrainians moving here as well, they're more Orthodox. So, and then say more Hispanic people will move here and they're more Catholic. Now it's a place where instead of being dominated, we're a very Christian country or a very Muslim country or whatever, it's so many different religions. Do you think that if someone was to move to a place where it's dominated by so many different religions, it would overall lose its religiosity because there's not one significant religion, or do you think it would gain religiosity just because there's so many options that people can fall into anyone?
I would say okay, let's say that immigration drives up the sort of the tide of religion, right? So the high water mark of religion rises because you have a lot of Muslims and a lot of Sikhs and a lot of Ukrainians moving to Edmonton. With this kind of thinking, it should raise the overall religious context of a little bit, right? Where everybody will kind of shift more towards religion because the social environment is friendlier to it and there's more religious activity and it's more prominent, right? So you're going to see, a little bit more religiosity. Again, it's a very slow pull. It's not going to be anything that you notice today, right? And for you, if you were non-religious, right? You identified as spiritual but not religious, right? But you like to do mindfulness and meditation and yoga, and you whip out the tarot cards now and then to divine your future. You might do that a little bit more, right? Because the overall religious context, your friends who are Sikhs are okay, we're going to temple today, and you're oh, spirituality in general, huh? Gonna rub my Reiki crystals, and I don't know what you do with Reiki crystals, to be honest. You can buy them on Amazon, so but whatever, you might move ever so slightly in that direction. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, but could it also make the country overall less religious because people are kind of conflicting in their religious beliefs with other religions, and it feels like each religion will kind of be see the side of the other person, and then overall the religion can throw off. Do you see how that's
it's a very searching question, and I will say it's an argument in a lot of theories of secularization. So when we get to, I think of Peter Berger in particular, which if we ever move off the slide, I guess we can get there someday. No, I'm kidding. It's good. They're great questions. His idea is that pluralism, right, will actually over time weaken religion, right? Specifically, I'm getting so far ahead of myself, but it'll weaken a couple of things. It'll weaken what he calls, I still can't write on that screen. Weekend, no, now I'm writing in yellow and that's not going to work. Okay, the sacred canopy, so that's Berger's term, sacred canopy, right? Or the kind of, and I'll explain it later, or the other term Berger uses is the symbolic universe, right? That you have a less unified symbolic universe. I ran out of space because I have big fat fingers. Symbolic universe is a little bit undermined by that pluralism. Now that said, I don't think the evidence goes all in one direction or the other, right? I think you can make a case for both a kind of contextual effect of lots of religious people of different religions generally leading to a more religious society, or pluralism potentially undermining religion in general. And I don't think, and we'll look at a bunch of different arguments from secularization theorists and then kind of anti-secularization theorists, both of whom I think make strong points in each direction. And I don't think it's entirely clear that one or the other is completely true. But let's say for like a causal mechanism, it's at least sort of a strong possibility that an increased religious environment is going to draw you in a more religious direction. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, again, there's no, I think in sociology of religion, there's no slam dunk, right? Because for every example you find of where maybe pluralism is decreasing religion, there's also examples of where, it's like the rising tide raises all boats, right? And so it's a bit of a question, and people are still trying to work it out. Rodney Stark, I love him. He's not Catholic, but he's my spirit animal. Also the honey badger of sociology of religion. He's very much like, more religion equals higher religiosity, right? Because it makes a more dynamic religious marketplace. Whereas others are like, oh, actually, more religious pluralism just means people see more religious options and then they doubt their religious option more, right? And it's like, well, why is my, orthodoxy better than, say, my friend who is Sikh, right? Or Muslim or whatever. And it's like, oh, if no religion is like a slam dunk, then maybe all religions are false, right? So, and I mean, that's sort of, again, I'm being a little bit quick with that argument, but I think that's kind of what you're getting at. And again, I don't think the evidence goes entirely in one direction or the other. I think there's strong cases to be made for both, right?
Yeah.
But does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That, like, the most religious countries, they usually revolve around one religion. Like, you don't see like that many places that are like very strong in religiosity that are like, oh, well, we have like all this diversity of religion. Usually, it's like, no, we believe in this one thing. And yeah.
So okay, and I'm going to spoil a little, but there is a case to be made, and Rodney Stark will make it, I think, very well, that actually unified religious systems tend to produce much weaker religions, right? What are called religious monopolies. They might look strong on the surface, but a lot of times they're actually pretty weak because the religions get lazy, right? It's like, everyone's Catholic here. Well, no need to do any work. Everybody's just going to show up. And especially in places like Germany where the state pays for everything, like they collect taxes for religions, religions tend to get very lethargic. So even though it's like, yes, we're all either Catholic or Lutheran, actual religiosity in Germany is very weak. But it might look really solid if you just took like census numbers. But you're getting me ahead of myself. Again, I could talk about this all day, which is what I'm paid for. But yeah, I mean, we'll get to those arguments and then, your questions, you'll have more questions. It'll be great. It'll be super fun. But great questions. Thank you so much. Like, I love the questions. It's really, there's such searching questions. I really appreciate them. And I'm joking that we never got off this slide, but I love it. So please don't feel like you can't ask questions. I am going to erase all my doodles to pretend they never happened though. Okay. Oh, I can do this one in 4 minutes. This one's pretty easy. Okay, so another causal mechanism, right, ways that religions influence societies is through social service programs, right? And this one I think should be fairly familiar, right? We think of the things that religious groups do even in the city of Edmonton, right, religious groups make a big impact in sort of the social landscape through services they offer. So, I mean, think of something like the mustard seed, or, oh, there's another shelter that's religious and it's escaping me. I'm just going to say the mustard seed because I can't remember the other one. Places like the mustard seed, right, and social service organizations that help people, right, sometimes that are affiliated with specific religions, and sometimes, groups that are sort of, para-religious, right? So they might be sort of like the mustard seed, vaguely Christian, but not connected to a specific kind of church. They just go out into the community and try to sort of help people, right? So you have things like, Catholic in Alberta or in Edmonton, Catholic Social Services, international organizations like Development and Peace, World Vision, Islamic World Relief, etc. Right? There are social service organizations that are religious, that offer services all over the world to their own people and to other people as well. So, we kind of recognize that they influence society by offering direct services, sometimes with the goal of converting people, sometimes just because, they see it as a religious prescription to help the poor, house the homeless, feed the starving, and those sorts of things, right? These are not merely conservative organizations, right? They span the kind of conservative to progressive divide in terms of their kind of ideologies. So we don't have to say, that it's just conservative religious people that do this. It's done kind of widely. Globally, annually, religious charities disperse somewhere in the range of $100 billion worth of aid worldwide, so a fairly substantial amount of money. That counts only cash. When it comes to like actual service done and like volunteers and people on the ground, it's difficult to calculate, simply because, how do you value people's time? How do you value people, the work that people do on this basis? It's really difficult. One study that looked at, is from the 2000s, that looked at all the social services provided by Philadelphia area religious groups, totaled the dollar value at $250 million. So basically, this is money that was being provided by religious communities to the people of Philadelphia, so not at taxpayer expense. And replacing those services would have cost about $250 million, right? So 250 million. It's impossible to calculate these services globally because the scope of them is simply so vast. There's so many organizations, they do so much work, and it's really hard to kind of say how much is actually done, but it is a lot, and we recognize how it influences, the societies we live in, hopefully. Okay, I am out of time. We'll pick up on 5 on Monday. Have a great weekend. And again, thanks for the questions. They were great questions. I really do appreciate them.